So, hey, welcome to another episode of the Eutychus Sessions. Not long enough to put you to sleep, but long enough to awaken a passion for all things gospel. We're continuing our series on exploring the Bible for yourself. And in the previous session, we went through the story of God together. And I hope that was a very helpful exercise to help you understand that the Bible is one big story, the grand narrative of God. And in this episode, I want to begin to break that story down just a little bit. And I want to share with you the movements of the story. Uh, there are various movements that we see within the story, as within any good story. There are various movements. We have the beginning, we have certain details that come along, and we have uh, there's some drama, there's just movements in a story, just like with our lives. We have certain periods of time that we go through in our lives. So the same is true of the Bible, the story of God. So I want to break that down for you just a little bit. And if you have not yet watched the video of the story of God, I encourage you right now to go and do that before you watch the rest of this one. It will really help you as we begin to look at these movements. So I encourage you to do that right now. Otherwise, stay tuned, and here we go. So let's take a look at the movements of the story of God. First, I'll draw an arc. This is a story arc. It shows progression. Every story moves in a direction. It has forward movement. So it is with the story of God. The first movement in God's story is that of creation. This is when all things began. God created the earth, the universe, sun, moon, stars, everything. Humanity, plants, animals. This comprises the first two chapters of the book of Genesis, creation. The theme of creation appears throughout Scripture. As we go further into the story of God, we encounter the movement then of rebellion. Rebellion is when sin entered the world. Adam and Eve made a deliberate choice to disobey God, to follow their own wisdom, and choose their own way. And thus it introduced the nature of sin upon humanity and all of creation. Sin had devastating effects on God's perfect creation and thwarted his original purpose in creation, that mankind would rule and reign with him over his creation. Rebellion. Then the next movement in God's story is promise. Because of the effects of sin, God gave a promise to a man named Abraham that through him all nations of the world would be blessed. It was through Abraham that the nation of Israel arose. And God's intent was for Israel to be a demonstration to the world of what God is truly like. They were to be a people who would live in God's ways and demonstrate his characteristics to everyone. But they failed in that, time and again, throughout their history. The promise comprises a good bit of the Scriptures, the Old Testament, from the book of Genesis all the way to the book of Malachi. It includes the stories of the kings, the stories of the prophets. The promise was pointing toward the next movement of God's story, and that is Jesus. Jesus is the apex of God's story. He is the central character of God's story. Jesus, the Son of God, the perfect human who came to live in God's ways and to show us what the Father is really like. What Adam and Eve had failed to do and what Israel had failed to do, Jesus perfectly did in showing us the Father. He lived in a way that we were to begin to live, and by the power of his Spirit, we could begin to walk in his ways. Jesus, this movement is found primarily in the Gospels. where we read about the life and teachings and ministry of Jesus. But Jesus is actually scattered throughout all of the scriptures, all of the Old Testament and all of the New Testament, because he truly is the centerpiece of the Bible. And as Jesus ascended back to the Father, he left behind a group of people who stayed together and lived as a family to walk in Jesus' ways. And this brings us to the next movement of God's story, and that is what was eventually called the church. The church was to be a new humanity that represented Jesus, walked in his ways, and encouraged others to begin to follow Jesus. The church was designed to be a demonstration, once again, of what the Father is like, and to picture to the world his characteristics. The New Testament period primarily covers this movement of God's story, the letters to various churches written by the Apostle Paul. And as we move toward the end of the story, God has an end in mind, and we can call it the movement of recreation or restoration. God will eventually completely restore all of creation back to the way he originally intended it. And things will be back to where God wanted it to start with. There will be no more pain, no more suffering, no more death. The way that God had designed from the very beginning will once again be taking place. And we're moving in that direction, even now, as we're living in this movement of the church in God's story. But even now, there is restoration and recreation taking place through the believers. One day God will bring this story to a close, but it all centers on Jesus. He is the center of this story. It's a grand story that we're looking at. So remember these movements of the story of God. Okay, we're back. I hope that was helpful for you, seeing the different movements of the story of God in and really understanding how it all fits together and how it moves. So what I would encourage you to do now is to write down these movements. Write them down and go back and watch the previous session where I tell the story of God, and listen to the story of God and look for those movements throughout the story. You can see how they begin to transition from one movement to another, and I hope that will help to make more sense of what we've shared today. So I encourage you to go do that right now. The story of God is so important. It's the major key to understanding how to really study the Bible for yourself. So I encourage you to do that. Hey, thanks again for tuning in, and I hope these sessions are helpful for you. I know I'm really enjoying being able to share these truths with you. So the very best to you. This has been the Eutychus Sessions, and we'll see you next time.